Did Ukraine strike a humiliating blow to Putin's Russian world project? And did they do it without firing a single shot? Plus, we're going to take a look at the collapsing ruble, Russian efforts to encircle Pokrovsk, and a deep strike by the Ukrainians on Russian territory. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into all these stories. Okay, so this is one of my favorite stories that's emerged over the last week, and this is about Transnistria. Now, for those of you that don't know, Transnistria is a breakaway region in Moldova. Let's see if we can find it on a map here. Now, the reason it's tough to actually find on a map is because official maps, they don't actually acknowledge it because it's not recognized internationally. In fact, the region of Transnistria, you can see it's literally addressed here as administrative territorial units within Moldova. Here's Moldova at large, and here is kind of the breakaway region. In general, you're going to see it running along this sector here. We're going to see on the Wikipedia page, you can see it, just a breakaway region along this kind of the Moldova-Ukraine border. And what's important about this is that Transnistria is not recognized by anyone in the UN. It's only recognized by other breakaway republics that are backed by the Kremlin, like South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And so what this is, though, is part of this movement towards the Russian world, right? Again, the West and Western media, they look at Ukraine as the Russian invasion of Ukraine as being this discrete, exceptional event. But to Russia, it's not. This is part of a steady campaign that they've been on to create new states and grow their Putin's so-called Russian world, right? And Transnistria has been a part of that for almost a decade. But all is not well in the Kremlin paradise that is Transnistria, right? And why is that? Well, the answer is because they can't get any gas, or more accurately, the Russians won't let them get any gas. Now, you remember, natural gas is used to heat homes and power stations, so it's more than just being able to fry up an egg or get the grill just right on your chicken. It's essential to living in a frigid post-Soviet country, right? And you might recall that Ukraine, as of 1 January, was no longer allowing Russian gas to transit their country, right? Striking a pretty significant blow to Russia. But the gas story, right? The Russian region of Transnistria has gas reserves now for just 24 days. This is, of course, because they cannot get Russian gas. Now, that doesn't mean they can't get gas at all, right? Moldova, for example, has said, we're happy to offer assistance. The EU has said, we're happy to offer assistance. In fact, the EU has publicly released some of the emails from the separatist government, the unrecognized government of Transnistria, in which Moldova and the EU said, listen, we have gas supplies, guys. We'll hook you up. But if that were to happen, Transnistria and its government would be seen as betraying the Kremlin, who have essentially sponsored their independence. And once Transnistria becomes dependent on Moldovan gas, well, they're going to likely be absorbed back into Moldova, officially or unofficially. At least that's the perception from the Kremlin and their puppets in Transnistria. So, right? And what happens, though, right now is that actually Russia just gifts gas to Transnistria. It doesn't charge them for it. In fact, Gazprom hands the gas over to their power station, which then sells the gas cheaply into Moldova, or sells the power cheaply to Moldova, in turn diminishing Moldova's ability to maintain a stable market for their own energy. So it is a win for the Kremlin, at least by their own perception, because they get to have this independent region. It doesn't depend on the EU and instead is totally dependent on Russia. In fact, technically, let's see if we can find it here. The Russians say that they've given something like billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars of free gas to Moldovans or to Transnistrians. And though, as Russia points out, it wasn't actually free. They just haven't collected on the bills. So it's sort of like Russia saying, hey, we're going to give you a credit card. You can put the gas on this credit card, and we won't make you start payment until we say so. And so the larger the balance on that credit card gets, the more Transnistria feels dependent on Russia. So Now, Moldova isn't getting away scot-free, right? Its gas prices have nearly doubled, and that is a huge problem. But here's the thing to take away from Transnistria, is that Transnistria has a lot of options, right? They have the EU help, but Russia also has options. They have a pipeline through Turkey that could easily get this gas to Transnistria. But the Kremlin themselves have said we refuse to do it, right? They don't want, likely, Turkey to have this leverage over them because Turkey's a NATO country. And so Transnistria has rejected the offer from Moldova to help the region purchase gas from Europe. Instead, they expect Gazprom to find a way to resume deliveries of natural gas. Now, again, this is something that the Moldovans really don't want to see, right? They want their breakaway region, obviously, to be back in Moldova. But right, prices in Moldova, electricity prices in Moldova are rising. But here's the thing. The average Transnistrian is pretty pissed, right? Transnistria is an unbelievably poor region. And it's harder and harder for them to see a country like Moldova that's making this EU pivot and is economically growing, whereas Transnistria is economically shrinking, right? The energy crisis, in fact, is prompting a lot of speculation that the Russian-controlled entity's survival is at stake, and it may be forced to integrate into Moldova at some point in the future. The people of Transnistria are this is a quote, the people of Transnistria are realizing that their so-called government in Tiraspol, the capital of the region, cannot ensure basic needs like heating, gas, or electricity. Naturally, the question will arise, what is the point of this regime? He said, quote, it's a big blow to the credibility and legitimacy of the Tiraspol regime, but also to the narrative of Russia as a trustworthy protector. This is one of the things that we've talked about extensively on this channel. When you have an authoritarian government, it curtails your freedoms, your choices, in exchange offers a high level of security. This is, for example, the deal that the Communist Party of China has essentially made with the Chinese people that say, we'll continue to deliver material prosperity and a rising standard of living in exchange for you tolerating our lack of free speech, your lack of choice in your political system. And the Chinese have largely taken that deal, right? But their country has experienced an unprecedented wave of industrialization and rising living standards. And the Transnistrians, they've experienced, well, they're now heating their homes with firewood. So they're not exactly on a rocket ship to economic prosperity, right? But the problem goes a little deeper, right? And the issue here is that because of this lack of... Moldova has its own problems with bringing in Transnistria, right? And one of the problems is, of course, Putin has also been running not just his annex new territory playbook, but he's been annexing his great replacement playbook as well. I'm probably going to get demonetized from YouTube for saying that. Which, by the way, guys, I wanted to mention that if you are a supporter of the channel and a fan of the channel, and you're interested in supporting me further and getting access to uncensored combat videos, including many that are sent to me from the units I linked up with in Ukraine, straight from the front lines, you want to become a member over on combatvetnews.com. This is my Patreon. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I drop new uncensored combat videos. We do a deep dive analysis of them. We just took a look at the viral video of a striker running around, running over North Koreans. Why were they doing that? Why did they feel the need to? And did the North Koreans even do the right thing? All of that, of course, is for you guys, for you members to find out my analysis, right? So if you want that, twice a week, sign up, become a member. Any one of these tiers will get you access, but you get even more bonuses like the Q&A videos for the higher tiers. So the link's in the description. Okay, so here's the problem that Moldova has, right? Is that Russia has also been running its little great replacement scheme. And what that is when Russia officially or unofficially occupies a region, it starts to do things like find Russian speakers and issues them Russian passports. They say, actually, you're Russian citizens. This is part of this. Russia is the Eurasian identity, and if you speak Russian, you are Russian, and therefore you're a citizen of Russia. And by creating all these dual citizens, it creates this deep loyalty, or what it believes is deep loyalty among the citizens of that region. They start to identify. They also do things like remove, for example, Moldovan history from schools and replace it with Russian history. All of these moves are things that help culturally colonize these new regions. And the problem that Moldova now has is, let's say Russia was to release its claims in Transnistria. Well, Moldova would have to take this region that's now been very Russified, whose voters are very Russified, and bring them into its economy. So it's going to do a couple of things. First, Moldova is going to be flooded with poor Transnistrians who now can depress wages for Moldovans. They're going to have to take a lot of their tax money that's going to Moldovans and going to support Transnistria, right? Literally rebuilding the region. But most importantly, you're going to have a block of voters who are now suddenly very pro-Russian. And you might recall recently that Russia narrowly lost, had a pro-Russian candidate narrowly lose the Moldovan elections. And that's without Transnistrian voters. So with the addition of Transnistrian voters, a lot of Moldovans say we may actually end up with a country that's under greater Russian influence, even though Russia's influence over Transnistria has ebbed. And so all of those fears kind of force this into a sort of weird kind of equilibrium, for lack of a better term. But again, the equilibrium exists because the Transnistrians largely want to be in Russia. If they start starving and are desperate, and the only people that come to save them is the Moldovan central government when they feel abandoned by the Kremlin, well, that Russian colonial effort is going to be for naught, right? Because again, people are only going to be loyal to a state that can provide the basic functions of a state, which is security and stability, right? There is no amount of flag waving and propaganda and persuasion that can change the stance of people when they're talking about their children being unable to eat, their homes being dangerously frozen. It's simply not something most people are willing to tolerate, North Koreans notwithstanding. Now, what does this mean for the Russian economy? Well, nothing great. As you can see, this is the 12-month chart of the ruble USD, and you can see that Russia's efforts to defend the ruble have been largely failing. And you can see here, they're looking increasingly desperate since November, as, again, remember, one of the things that when Russia sells gas, it sells it for rubles. You have to buy rubles to sell this gas. And as you could see, the market realizing that that Russian gas is not going to be for sale, at least the Russian gas that transits through Ukraine, that means that there's even more rubles and even fewer people that want them. So the Russian central bank, of course, deploying the last weapons in its arsenal to stabilize the currency, but you can see they're getting their absolute clock cleaned. And they keep trying to fight to stabilize it, but you can see it's back on the decline. And I think you're going to see the Russian currency continue to get hammered as the Russian economy overheats, as they print more and more rubles, and fewer people want them to buy Russian goods and services. But on the battlefield, Russia may be claiming to have additional successes. See, over on ISW, they're reporting that the T504 Highway running from Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka is actually been split by Russian forces, right? And that this in turn is going to make it very hard for Ukraine to resupply some of its forces here in the south. And one of the areas I want to point out that I think this may be the case is some of these regions south of Pokrovsk, right? So the T504 Highway, let's see if we can ID it here. Actually, this isn't the best map for IDing this sort of stuff. Here we go. The T504 Highway here in the south, you can see there's Pokrovsk and there's T406. Let's see, T505. 515. I believe what we're looking at is probably around here somewhere. It may be this highway here, but this kind of cutoff, in some ways it can be seen as pretty dangerous, right? I think they're referring to this highway here. It's the only one that's been recently cut off and that holds this geopolitically strategic position. So this is problematic because you can see it's a feeder into Pokrovsk. Remember, Pokrovsk has been functioning largely as a hub where a lot of supplies are brought in and then distributed to units on the front line. And with Russia initially attempted to seize Pokrovsk via a frontal assault. They failed. Instead, they went through this large swath of open territory, taking tremendous casualties by almost any metric. But now you can see them actually flanking Pokrovsk, meaning that many of these units here are going to have a harder time being resupplied, right? The supplies have to come in, again, from the M30 or from the 515 and then get distributed outwards. So this is part of this Russian strategy, but it's not all that effective, right? Because the problem is that while these units defending in this area are having a harder time with the collapse of the 406, Ukraine, because Russia's pace is so glacial, they cannot take advantage of the core of maneuver warfare, right? Which is the element of surprise, right? The Ukrainians likely had been for days or probably even weeks shifting their logistics systems to supply units via M30 and other units and other roads in central Pokrovsk. So I'm not seeing necessarily the crisis emerging yet, but this is part of this Russian strategy. Again, you're likely seeing the Ukrainians pivot towards some of these other roadways running from the north and from the west. But again, this is the Russian strategy relies on patience and a lot of attrition. And that's something that we are starting to see here. Now, two other stories that I thought were really interesting. First is, of course, the Ukrainians actually doing some level of localized counterattacking in Shevchenko. And you can see here that, right, you've got Russians taking this position in the village itself, and Ukrainians kind of driving them out and putting the Russians into this lowland here outside the village. This is likely part of an effort. The Russians likely want to try to encircle Ukrainian forces here, and the Ukrainian forces in turn want to try to withdraw, particularly from regions like this Konstantinopoletsky. And this will happen. They are going to withdraw, right? You can see there's very few reliable roadways here, and the Ukrainians are fighting to keep this open. But again, if you're one of the soldiers fighting in this lowlands here, the Ukrainians likely know you have to withdraw, right? You have this big obstacle here. You already have a very narrow canal in which you can pass through. In all likelihood, the Ukrainians, you're going to see them pull out of here and they're going to reestablish a defensive line. But you could see that there's nothing in here worth defending. I don't know what else to tell you. This is just empty farmland and a classic Russian maneuver where they're going to pat themselves on the back for seizing the thriving metropolitan hub of Dachne, which appears to be approximately 6 city blocks. So I don't put a lot of stake in this, again, particularly because the Ukrainian strategy is to inflict maximum Russian casualties, not to stop Russia from seizing territory. But, right, key to that is Ukraine's efforts to conduct drone strikes. And this is, I think, the final story I wanted to talk about. And one of the most interesting is that Ukraine has been ramping up its deep strike drone program. And it describes this attack as actually its most massive attack against the Russian military facilities, with hitting targets up to 620 miles away, targeting chemical plants, refineries, and the Engels Air Base ammunition depots. According to Ukraine, these were all successfully targeted. Now, what they all have in common, which I think is interesting, is they're all highly flammable, right? If you have a sense of the layout of these chemical plants, you can send a drone to target known areas where there's a high level of flammability. Refineries, right? Again, if you know where in the refinery you want to hit, you can create some really bad fires. And of course, ammunition depots, classic. And so all of these, this is one of the things that we've talked about, is that Ukrainian drones, they have to trade off range for payload, and they have lighter payloads, but it means that if they can identify areas where the drone is not the destructive element, most of the destruction is going to be caused by things already at that facility. Again, for example, a chemical plant that has flammable chemicals. If they can just treat the drone as the detonator, as the thing that's going to ignite those areas, that is going to be their maximum ability to be destructive. And conveniently, munition plants, military munition plants, not entirely, right? For example, a military vehicle factory may not have much flammable material to hit, but a lot of places, if you build weapons, if you manufacture ammunition or petrochemicals, you're probably explosive. So a lot of essential warfighting facilities are very, very blow-upable. And so Ukraine has been taking advantage of that, targeting from regions from Tatarstan to Tula. You can see on the map here the scale of, or the scope rather, of this operation, right? With strikes hitting, again, Bryansk, Tula, right, a Moscow suburb, and even as far out, reportedly, as this Alamyetvetsk, right? But it's unclear. Again, the further out you get, the more sort of speculative the reporting gets. But the important thing to take away here is, again, that the Ukrainians are committed to proving a point, which is they have the ability to touch the Russians anywhere. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Hit that subscribe button. Huge thank you to the Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com, like Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gowers, Marning, Gina Questa, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Karius, AL90, Petra Taruru, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate all you guys so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.